In the United States today, nearly 52 million people are immigrants. They work our farms, build our homes, attend our universities, and serve in our hospitals. Yet, at the same time, hundreds of thousands of people are detained or deported each year under increasingly aggressive immigration enforcement. To understand our current policies, we first need to understand immigration in our country and how the system works. Immigration usually begins with a visa, which allows someone to enter the U.S. for a specific purpose, such as work, school, or family reunification. Some visas lead to permanent residency, also known as a green card. After meeting residency and legal requirements, green card holders may apply for citizenship and gain full political rights. There are also long-standing paths to permanence, such as family-based immigration, where citizens and lawful residents sponsor relatives. There is employment-based immigration tied to labor needs and skills, and there are diversity visas meant to expand representation from underrepresented groups. Historically, immigration to the United States has come in distinct waves. In the late 1800s, Chinese, Japanese, and other Asian workers immigrated in large numbers to work on railroads, agriculture, and mining. In the 1920s, nativist groups like the KKK pushed anti-immigrant laws targeting Asians, Catholics, and Jews. The Immigration Act imposed racist ideologies and banned most Asian immigration, delaying large-scale Asian migration until laws changed in 1965. The second Klan that emerged around 1915 expanded its targets beyond Black Americans to include immigrants, Catholics, Jews, and foreigners. Immigrants were portrayed as criminals and threats to American identity. In direct correlation to the current administration, immigrants, both legal and illegal, are painted as criminals to push an anti-immigrant agenda based on racism. Despite certain views of immigrants claiming they cause erosion of Western American lifestyles and cut wages and take jobs, immigration has been one of the most important forces shaping the United States over the last several decades. Since 1965, nearly 59 million immigrants have arrived in the U.S. When you include their descendants, immigrants and their families have added roughly 72 million people, accounting for around 40% of U.S. population growth. This shows that immigration wasn't just a small factor, it was a major driver of population growth for half a century.
Under the Trump administration, immigration enforcement has shifted dramatically towards mass deportations, with numbers that put them on track for the highest levels in decades. At the same time, traditional crime enforcement like drug prosecutions has fallen to the lowest levels in decades as resources have been redirected towards immigration. So far, over 225 judges in more than 700 cases have ruled that the administration's mass detention policies likely violate the law and due process. In one ruling, a judge said the administration's approach affords to such individuals no process, let alone due process, highlighting constitutional concerns. Temporary restraining orders have even blocked policies targeting unaccompanied immigrant children, showing that judicial oversight remains a necessary check on executive power. Public opinion also shows mixed reactions, recent polls indicating growing doubts whether the administration is targeting the right people with its crackdown, suggesting that even strong enforcement policies face political limits. Economically and socially, history shows that strict enforcement can have unintended consequences. For example, during the Great Depression, strict deportations of Mexican immigrants and Mexican-American citizens disrupted labor markets and communities, showing that aggressive enforcement can both harm immigrants and U.S. workers. Today, critics warn that similar patterns could happen if mass deportations continue without addressing legal pathways, visas, and green card backlogs. By comparing today's policies to historical examples, we can see a repeating cycle. Without proper balance between executive action, Congress, and the courts, enforcement can escalate quickly, creating legal, social, and economic problems. This is why using checks and balances, judicial enforcement, and proper funding for due process is so important.
Today's immigrant population is incredibly diverse. Immigrants come from nearly every region of the world and range from documented immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, individuals under temporary protected status, also known as TPS, and undocumented immigrants. As recent data shows, in 2024, the United States received 1,425,000 new immigrants. 6% were labor migrants, 68% were family members, and 17% were humanitarian migrants. Humanitarian immigration is a critical part of the system. Refugees flee persecution and undergo extensive vetting before entering the United States. Asylum seekers request protection once inside the country, while TPS status allows people from countries experiencing war or natural disasters to remain temporarily. These policies recognize that immigration is often about safety and survival, not just choice. Yet the systems meant to process humanitarian and legal immigration are overwhelmed. Immigration courts face millions of pending cases nationwide, with only a few hundred judges responsible for handling them. As a result, many families wait years for decisions, not because the law is unclear, but because the system lacks sufficient resources and staffing. This pressure is reflected in asylum demand. In 2023, the United States alone received more than 1.17 million new asylum applications, more than the next 7 top OECD countries combined. The scale of these applications raises serious questions about processing capacity and due process. Immigrants are deeply integrated into American life. They work essential jobs in agriculture, construction, healthcare, and service industries. Others are students, professionals, or small business owners. The majority pay taxes and raise families and contribute to their communities. Long-term outcomes show this clearly. About 89.9% of refugees residing in the United States for 20 plus years have become citizens, and 59.2% own homes. Refugees also display entrepreneurial activity, with 188,000 refugee entrepreneurs generating $5.1 billion in business income. These numbers counter narratives that refugees are a long-term burden by showing stability, economic contribution, and civic participation. There is a question of whether current U.S. policies support integration and legal stability, or whether they push immigrants into prolonged uncertainty and fear despite clear evidence of long-term contribution and successful integration.
Modern immigration debates in the United States are increasingly dominated by enforcement, particularly the role of ICE. ICE operates under the Department of Homeland Security and was originally created to enforce immigration laws. However, under President Donald Trump, ICE's role expanded dramatically, shifting from targeted enforcement towards mass deportation strategies. According to The Atlantic, ICE officers are often dressed in non-uniforms, often without badges or identification, seizing people, some of them even U.S. citizens, and driving them away, offering them no process. These practices raise serious concerns under the Fourth Amendment, which protects against unreasonable searches and seizures and requires probable cause. Recent data shows how dramatically enforcement has intensified. In the first half of 2025, ICE carried out over 100,000 arrests, according to VisaVerge. Notably, 44% of those arrests had no criminal record, while arrests of individuals with criminal convictions fell to 30%. This marks a major shift away from historical focus on serious offenders. Detention numbers further reflect this change. By July 24, 2025, ICE was detaining 59,000 immigrants, the highest number ever recorded in U.S. history. Nearly half of detainees had no criminal history, and most arrests occurred through interior enforcement, meaning far from the border. This indicates that long-term residents, people embedded in local communities, are increasingly being detained. Over the past year, more than 260,000 people were booked into ICE detention, with internal goals reportedly reaching 3,000 arrests per day. In 2025, ICE experienced its deadly year in over 2 decades, with 31 deaths in custody. These deaths raise serious concerns about detention conditions and oversight. A law signed on July 4th added 10,000 ICE agents and nearly $75 billion in funding, making ICE one of the largest federal police forces in the country. At the same time, immigration courts receive well under $1 billion annually, creating a system where enforcement far exceeds the ability to provide due process. These statistics show that modern immigration enforcement is broader, more aggressive, and less targeted than in the past. As ICE's power expands, concerns about constitutional protections, due process, and community-wide fear extends beyond immigrants themselves, affecting the rights and security of everyone.
Modern immigration enforcement shows a lot about how power actually works in real life. For example, Supreme Court Justice Brett Kavanaugh has said that immigration stops can be based on things like speaking Spanish or speaking English with an accent, along with a person's job, where they are, or even their race or ethnicity. That basically means people can be targeted not because they did something wrong, but because of how they sound or look. That's racial profiling, and it doesn't just scare undocumented immigrants. It also worries legal residents and U.S. citizens who feel like they could be questioned just for having an accent or looking foreign. These kinds of practices also feed harmful stereotypes, especially the idea that immigrants steal American jobs, But the data shows something different. Immigrants often work in industries like agriculture, construction, and manual labor, jobs that the U.S. economy really depends on. When fewer immigrants work in these fields, costs go up, productivity drops, businesses struggle, and the U.S. economy faces crashing. International students are another example. When immigration enforcement became stricter, international enrollment dropped by 17%, the biggest drop in 10 years. Yet those students bring in about $42.9 billion a year and support more than 355,000 American jobs. Instead of hurting the economy, they help keep it running. Overall, modern immigration enforcement hurts the economy more than it helps. Cutting off immigrant labor raises costs, slows productivity, and strains industries that keep the country running. And when stricter policies drive away international students, the U.S. risks losing billions in revenue and hundreds of thousands of supported jobs.
The core problem facing the United States today is not the existence of immigration law, but how that law is enforced. Immigration policy has become increasingly selective and inconsistent, shaped more by executive orders and agency directives than by legislation passed through Congress. As a result, enforcement priorities shift depending on who holds power rather than remaining grounded in stable democratic lawmaking. Public opinion reflects this instability. Nearly 80% of respondents reported dissatisfaction with how the U.S. immigration system currently operates, and 84.5% believe immigration laws are not applied fairly or consistently. This inconsistency contributes directly to the nation's wealth gap. When immigrants lack realistic legal pathways or due process, many remain undocumented, limiting access to stable employment and fair wages. 78.6% of respondents believe that expanding legal immigration pathways would increase compliance with the law, showing that enforcement alone does not create order. Instead, it pushes workers into exploitative conditions while the government spends billions on detention rather than efficient legal processing. Under the Trump administration, immigration enforcement relied heavily on executive authority. While this allowed rapid policy changes, it weakened checks and balances. Nearly 70% of respondents expressed concern about immigration policy being shaped primarily through executive action rather than Congress. Civil rights groups and federal courts have also raised due process concerns, and public opinion strongly agrees. Over 75% of respondents say compliance with due process protections is important, with a strong majority calling it very important. Despite this, enforcement has been prioritized over legal integration. Nearly 80% of respondents support allowing undocumented immigrants to earn legal status through work, taxes, background checks, or military service. At the same time, enforcement disproportionately targets workers instead of employers, even though over 57% of respondents believe employers should be the primary focus or share equal responsibility. This imbalance is most visible in federal funding. Congress has seized roughly $75 billion for ICE over 4 years, about $18.7 billion per year, nearly tripling the agency's budget. About $45 billion of that is dedicated to detention alone, supporting over 116,000 detention beds. Meanwhile, immigration courts receive far less funding. For every $24 spent on enforcement, only $1 spent on immigration courts. As of tax year 2024, 725 immigration judges were responsible for 3.7 million pending cases, nearly 5,000 cases per judge. Detention costs average $142 per person per day, or about $51,800 per detainee per year, contributing to an estimated $30 billion annually spent on detention. This raises a critical question. How can funding be redirected to restore balance without expanding executive power? Our solution is shifting funds towards courts and legal representation. 82.5% of respondents support holding immigration agencies legally accountable when they fail to follow existing law. Redirecting just $5 billion from detention to immigration courts could increase court budgets nearly tenfold. Over 70% support requiring judicial approval for extended detention, and more than 2/3 support independent legal audits of immigration agencies. Nearly 80% believe improving legal pathways would increase compliance with immigration law. Ultimately, a checks and balances approach to immigration reform requires equilibrium between enforcement, adjudication, and accountability. Redirecting even a portion of detention and enforcement funding could create a system that is more efficient, lawful, and humane without weakening border control or congressional authority. Immigration reform is not only a policy question but a democratic one. When enforcement is driven by executive discretion rather than transparent lawmaking and judicial oversight, power concentrates in the hands of a political minority rather than reflecting majority public opinion. This erosion of the rule of law disproportionately harms immigrants and working class communities. deepening the wealth gap by sustaining exploitative labor systems. Reform grounded in due process, accountability, and accessible legal pathways does not weaken democracy. It reinforces it by ensuring that immigration law is enforced fairly, consistently, and in accordance with constitutional principles.